My name is George Sugai, and I'm at the University of Connecticut. I'm in the special education program in the Department of Educational Psychology. I've been at the University of Connecticut for 11 years now, and I was at the University of Oregon prior to that for 21 years. That history is relatively important because much of the work that I've been doing has been evolving out of those two particular institutions. At the University of Oregon, when I started there 35 years ago, I was primarily focused in special education, working with children with emotional and behavioral disorders. And what we've learned in some of that work in earlier at the University of Oregon was about the relationship between individual student supports and how that is affected by classrooms and schools and communities and families. And at least from our perspective, we weren't organizing ourselves very well around larger communities, but very focused on individuals. My colleague Rob Horner, who I co-direct the National Center with at the University of Oregon, and also Tim Lewis at the University of Missouri, we came together and said, it's probably good to think of systemically about how do we support individual students within the larger context of systems. My presentation today was really about how we think about systems and organizations in a systematic way. Two of my main messages from that presentation today was, one, you really have to think about building a continuum of support for all individuals within an organization, regardless if it's a classroom or a school or a workplace or an institutional setting or group home. How's everyone being served in a way that's supportive and constructive, so that when we work with individual students, those plans are more likely to have an effect. The second message from today was we have to think beyond evidence-based practices. I think we've had a lot of attention on evidence-based practices, and we have good tools. I think we could always improve those tools, but at the same time, many of these evidence-based practices may not have the effect that we want because we don't pay attention to the alignment with student need, the alignment with what the data indicate, and also how much support do the implementers have. Because the best evidence-based practice is going to fail if we don't implement it with the greatest degree of fidelity. The fidelity question is important because it's not just about how well we follow the manual, it's about how also we contextually fit it with the individual and in the environment in which that individual must navigate. One thing that's pretty important about my history and my evolution in working with children and youth and so forth is that I spent most of my time working with individual students, and I think I've got good experience writing individualized plans and focusing on what we all kind of value around person-centered planning. But in some of my initial work in schools, what we realized quickly was that our individual plans weren't having the big impact that we would like to have because these larger environments were not very efficient or very effective. So for example, I can always remember being asked to go in and observe a student in a classroom. And I wasn't given much information about who that student was and what he in this case looked like. And I walked into the classroom not really being able to figure out which student it was that I was supposed to watch, because many students were engaged in behavior that was challenging or causing disruptions in the classroom. And then the quick realization was, even if I knew who that student was and even if I built a plan, I wasn't confident that that plan would have much impact in a classroom where many students were having similar challenges, with or without disabilities. And so much of our work has been focusing on, well, how important it is to look at the local climate or the local culture of the classroom, the school, the workplace. If you look at some of the best employment research, what we've learned is that most employers are pretty happy with teaching the employee about how to do the job, but what they really want is that employee to have the social skills, to get along with their coworkers, to be able to follow the directions or instructions from a supervisor. And we don't prepare people very well for that. And the environments oftentimes aren't set up to be able to do that well. So a lot of our work has been, how do we make sure that these environments are welcoming? How do we make sure that these environments, as my friend Rob Horner calls them, competent teaching and learning environments, so that when these students who have pretty intensive need with very complicated individualized interventions are more likely to have an effect. I work with individuals with disabilities, but I think I spend most of my time now working with the adults in those environments, classrooms, school administrators, psychologists. and how do they work together to build these more receptive environments so individual student work can be effective. So one of the things that we are investing quite a bit of time in is how do we promote good social skills, and social skills in that broad range from self-management as well as interacting with others, as well as being able to navigate the teaching and learning environment well, or even the workplace environment. One thing we're learning is that social skills are really important, but we also have to think about teaching them more directly. If social skills were as easy as watching somebody, then we wouldn't have these conversations. But one thing we've learned is that many settings don't understand that social skills are important to academic success, to work success, to family success, and so forth. So we've been really pushing hard for social skills instruction to be explicit and to be deliberate. And what I mean by that is that we really have to spend time teaching social skills like we teach academic skills. When students make academic errors, we don't punish them. We don't say you're stupid and send them to the office. We don't send them home. We don't send them to their room. We actually spend time reteaching. And I like us to think about social skills in the same way. I mean, a skill is a skill, a behavior is a behavior. Learning how to calculate the hypotenuse of a triangle is exactly the same as how we would learn how to manage our anger. And what I mean by that is that we, the students and others, have to see it, we have to practice it, and we need to know what it looks like across different environments, because managing your anger in a recreational setting looks a little bit different than it would in a classroom setting, which would look different than at a social event or in the workplace. So we have to teach across those different environments. Now, when I say that, one thing that's happening in many of our settings is we teach social skills in the isolation of these more natural environments. For example, it's not uncommon for some of the schools we work in for social skills to be taught at a specific time and one day a week. So for example, a class or school might have social skills being taught between 9 and 9:30 only on Mondays. And the student learns about respect and responsibility and safety from 9 to 9:30. But then the student learns, well, 9:31 we switch to math, and I don't have to worry about respect, responsibility, and safety. And so we're trying to get staff to understand that it's not just about teaching the skill, it's about teaching the fluent use of the skill in other settings. And that doesn't happen naturally. We actually have to remind children, we have to remind ourselves about what that means in different settings. So we've always liked to promote the idea that social skills are required across the school day. It's required when the teacher gives a direction. It's required when you're in the workplace and your boss gives a direction. It's required when you're in a community setting in a recreational program where you have to learn how to follow the rules. Those are all social skills, and if we don't teach them across multiple settings, we're going to lose the impact of our instruction. I think there is a place for acquisition level learning, which means that the student has no idea what the social skills look like. But in our experience, most of our students have been taught many, many times the same skill multiple years in a row. But what we're not doing is teaching how to use it fluently across settings. And that requires that we integrate social skills instruction into our academic instruction, for example. One of the best examples I've seen of that is a teacher who said, "Okay, class, let's get ready for reading now. I really appreciate the way you all got started on time. That's being very responsible. Don't forget to get your reading materials out so we can start the lesson. Thank you very much, George, for getting your materials ready. I thought it was really being responsible." So here's an instruction where they're using the language of social skills at the same time they're getting ready for their teaching of an academic task. I love it when a teacher says, "You know what, you got that answer correct. 7 plus 7 is 14. You answered on time. That's being very responsible. I appreciate the way you waited while this other person was answered. That's also being very respectful." When teachers can build in the social skills language into their day-to-day activities, just like an employer would do the same thing with their employees, just like we would do in a recreational program as well. And lastly, just because I know many of the people that Bild works with focus on families, I love it when parents can build in the social skills language as well. There's a story about a family member who called the school and said, "You know what, we found it very helpful that you're teaching respect and responsibility at school, because when my child came home from school, they were using respect and responsibility in their language. And now we can use it at the dinner table, we can use it during homework time, and we can use it when the student is getting ready for school in the morning." One way we like to think about teaching social skills, going back to that topic again, is that the learner has a learning history. And that learning history is made up of a set of actions or behaviors, or as Charles Duhigg calls them, habits. And habits are kind of behaviors or actions that become useful to us because they work. Sometimes, however, those behaviors don't work very well in other settings. So for example, some students, some individuals might use their fists to manage anger, or they might use inappropriate language to manage anger. And that might be okay in some settings, but in other settings it's not appropriate. But if they have many opportunities to use those behaviors, it becomes habitual. And what we've learned is that habitual behaviors are hard to change because the cues are always there to promote them, and the rewards or acknowledgments always happen at the other end to make them successful. As we've learned in the PBS world, behavior has purpose, it has function, and it works. And if it works, we can continue to use them over and over again. With many of the individuals we work with, the behaviors they engage in are inappropriate in some settings. And we ask them to change those behaviors, but it's really hard for them because they're habits. And when we think about teaching replacement behaviors or alternatives or better ways, we have to acknowledge that what we want to teach may not serve the same purpose as those bad habits. So for example, in a school classroom environment, we have children who learn that when difficult work is given to them, if they rip it up, teachers come right over and take it away from them because they're not ready to learn. And if they do that over and over again, the child learns that the best way to get rid of work that's too difficult is to complain about it because it's removed. If this happens over years and over many opportunities, they establish a bad habit. The problem is that when teachers say, well, we need to teach that kid to try. If the work is too hard, try. So the alternative is to teach the child to try the first problem. The problem with using that as the first step is that trying doesn't result in the removal of that work. Because when the child tries, the teacher comes over and says, nice job, you got that problem correct, now do the next one. So then again, what the child learns is, well, that wasn't very effective for me because I still have to do the work. And what we've learned is you got to teach or help the child learn an alternative that works for them. So for example, it could be, given these three problems, do this one and then we'll come back in 15 minutes to do the next problem. So the work is removed temporarily but returned a little bit later. Or we say, I want you to work with Ken because Ken will help you get that problem and this worksheet done because he will help you get it done. By having help get it done, it's removed in a different way. So this notion about teaching an alternative to kind of compete against the habit is a difficult concept, but so important because the people we work with tend to have behaviors that have worked for them for many years. And if we don't acknowledge that and come up with a strategy that at least anticipates that problem, One of the things I've learned from a good friend of mine, Jeff Colvin, is that you have to pre-correct for habits, meaning you have to do something before the problem occurs. So if you have trouble waking up in the morning, one of the best things to do is to do what? Set an alarm clock. If you sleep through the alarm clock, the best thing to do is set 2 alarm clocks, one across the room. And if you still have trouble waking up, the best thing to do is to ask somebody else who you're close to, like your mother, to call you in the morning. Those are all pre-corrects. What they do is prevent the error from happening in the first place, so you can be successful. If you're successful, you're more likely to not use the bad habit, but instead use the good habit. One thing that's pretty important to me is that we have a pretty sophisticated, pretty effective technology. And the technology has been very helpful to us in learning about how we can meet the needs of students and adults and so forth. However, one thing about the technology is that it's difficult to achieve buy-in because the technology is something that a set of researchers and some highly trained individuals, school psychologists, social workers, and so forth have developed and are trying to communicate. So one thing we've learned in my world around positive behavioral support and working in schools is that if you're going to achieve buy-in, so that school administrators, family members, school teams, all can say that this is worthwhile doing, we really have to be considerate of that environment and where those people are coming from. So I am a trained behavior analyst. That's what my history has been. That's what my toolkit is. I'm pretty comfortable with that. I can defend my decisions using that technology. But the world of behavior analysis has a language that is not common to the general public and frankly to schools. it's only really known to a fairly small community of learners and users. I think our success and our ability to transfer or to spread positive behavioral support has become, we've been able to translate that language into language that is more common. So instead of saying positive reinforcement, we've said, it's really important to acknowledge children for what they do and let them know what they've done and where they've done it. Instead of saying we've got to establish stimulus control, we've said, it's really important to teach children when to use a skill and when not to use it and what it looks like across these different environments. Instead of saying, it's really important that we arrange the environment for generalized responding to occur, it's much more useful for us to say, let's teach that skill across multiple environments. Let's help the learner remember what to do in these different settings in which they have to navigate. It's also important, I think, for us to be able to say, for adults to be successful, it's really important we arrange these environments so they can be successful. We need to provide reminders. We might need to provide acknowledgments and corrective feedback. And so what we've learned is you have to translate that language. Another part of our world of positive behavioral support is using language like person-centered planning and wraparounds and so forth. And those are great terms that kind of capture the value system that we have. But I'm not sure that the general public understands what wraparound means and what does person-centered planning mean. And I think it's incumbent upon us to be able to translate into saying, person-centered planning means that we're going to help the student and the family become the center of what we do. And we're going to try to make sure that we listen to what their needs are and what they value and what they think that their strengths are. Person-centered planning means that we're going to help make sure that the parent and family helps us understand how we can provide the best services and supports. So I think, one of the things about buy-in is, do we use a language that allows people to understand what we do? And quickly, two other things that help with buy-in, and that is we've got to make sure that when we implement interventions that we can have some confidence that it produces the outcomes that we promise. Because if the student, the family, the client, or whatever we call that individual who receives the intervention, if they don't experience success with it, they're probably going to check out. They're not going to buy or accept that. If we give an intervention to a teacher or a therapist and say, try this with your family or child, and it doesn't work, they're going to set aside that intervention. So we have to help, I think, put in place interventions that have a high likelihood of having some initial success, or at least saying, we're going to try to help the student manage his anger, but the first step in getting there is for the child to stop and catch themselves and take 2 seconds before they respond. So if they can experience and know what initial success looks like, then they're more likely to buy into it. And the last one is that we as change agents have to acknowledge the people who are implementing the interventions. I'm pretty confident that we ask people to do things, but we don't treat them with the same level of respect that we ask them to experience with their clients or their children or the adults with whom they work. So I need to make sure, we let the implementers know that they made a great effort in implementing that particular strategy. I noticed that you provided the reminder, and that's really important to this particular intervention working. And I just want you to know that you were that was a good example of responsibility that you were communicating to your learner.